Anna Kane was 26 years old. She had 3 children at home, a daughter named Tamika, who was 9, 2 boys. She was the kind of mother who, and I want you to hear this before we go any further, her daughter would describe decades later as loving, caring, outgoing, honest, not a case file, not a background check, not the single reductive word the newspapers would use to describe her after she died. A loving mother. Caring and outgoing and honest, on the night of October 22nd, 1988, Anna Kane left her home in Berks County, Pennsylvania. It was a Saturday. It had been raining since before midnight. The streets of Reading were wet and dark and quiet, the way streets get in the early hours of a Sunday morning when most people are home. She was last seen alive at approximately 1 in the morning, near Franklin Street and South 6th Street in Reading. She never came home. Her daughter Tamika was 9 years old on the morning she woke up, and her mother was gone, 9 years old. Old enough to know that something enormous and permanent had happened. Not old enough to understand what it meant to spend the next 34 years living inside a story without an ending. 34 years later, Tamika stood in front of cameras and said the most important sentence I have ever read about this case. She said she was a person. She was my mother. That sentence should not need to be said, but it does. And by the time this episode is over, you will understand exactly why she felt she had to say it. Because the man who killed Anna Kane did not just take her life and walk away clean. He left something behind. Something that in 1988 had no name and no meaning. Something that sat in an evidence file for 34 years while science slowly and quietly caught up to what he thought he had buried forever. He licked an envelope. That single, mundane, automatic action, the kind every person does without thinking when they seal a letter, became the most consequential mistake of his entire life. Stay with me, because this story is one of the most extraordinary cold cases I have ever told. And Anna Kane has been waiting 34 years for someone to tell it the way it deserves to be told. Welcome to Buried Verdict. Some verdicts were buried before they could ever be delivered. Tonight we dig up one that a killer tried to seal inside an envelope in 1990 and paid for with his name 34 years later, Anna Kane. This is her story. Reading, Pennsylvania, Berks County, 1988. I want you to picture this place. Not the Pennsylvania of covered bridges and chocolate factories and autumn foliage that makes it onto postcards. The real Pennsylvania, the working Pennsylvania. Reading in 1988 was a city that was hurting. It had been built on manufacturing, on textiles, on iron, on the kind of industrial backbone that kept families employed for generations and gave a city its identity. By 1988, most of that was gone. Mills had closed, factories had moved or disappeared entirely. The jobs that had made Reading what it was for 100 years had quietly vanished, and the city was still in the painful process of figuring out who it was without them. That economic collapse created the conditions that economic collapse always creates: poverty that deepens, communities that fragment, people who fall through gaps that weren't supposed to exist. It is not a moral failure of the people who lived it. It is what happens when the economic foundation of a place is pulled out from under it and nothing is put in to replace it. Around the city of Reading, Berks County spread outward into farmland and small boroughs. Hamburg, in the northern part of the county, a small town with a main street and a diner, and people who knew each other's names. Birdsboro, about 10 miles south of Reading, a borough with its own mill history, its own tight-knit community, its own particular sense of itself. In the months before October 1988, 2 people had each made a significant move. They had each relocated to the Birdsboro area. One of them was Anna Kane. The other one was the man who would kill her. At the time, nobody knew their paths had crossed. Nobody knew that the geography of their lives had quietly, terribly overlapped. That detail would not matter for 34 years. 1988 in America had a particular feeling to it. Reagan was finishing his last year in office. Die Hard was in theaters. Guns N' Roses had just released Appetite for Destruction, and it was on every radio everywhere. The Cold War was winding down, though nobody could quite believe it yet. And in cities like Reading, Rust Belt cities, post-industrial cities, cities that had given a lot and received very little in return, the crack epidemic was moving through with a particular devastating efficiency of something that goes where desperation already lives. In that world, Anna Kane was doing what mothers do when the world makes it hard. She was managing. she was getting through. She had 3 children who needed her, and she was showing up for them, imperfectly and completely, the way that parents who don't have enough of anything still somehow find a way to show up. She was 26 years old, she was struggling, she was loved by her children, and on the night of October 22nd, 1988, she walked out into a rainstorm and never came back. Anna Kane. I want to spend time here, real time. Because what happened to Anna after her death, the way she was described, the way her case was treated, the way her name was handled by a world that decided certain things about her before it knew anything real about her, that is as much a part of this story as the crime itself. She was 26 years old. Her daughter Tamika was 9. 9 years old, which means she was old enough to have genuine memories of her mother. Old enough to remember what her laugh sounded like, what her presence felt like in a room. The small specific details that make a person real and irreplaceable. Details that exist now only in Tamika, only in the 2 boys, only in the people who were close enough to actually know her. After Anna's body was found, the local media did what local media often did, and sometimes still does, with victims whose lives had been complicated. They reached for the easiest, most reductive description available. They called her a prostitute. They mentioned her criminal record. They constructed a version of Anna Kane that made her death feel, to a casual reader, like something sad but somehow predictable. Like the story of a woman who had made choices that led to this, and what can you really say? Tamika, Anna's daughter, grew up reading those descriptions of her mother. She grew up in a world that had already decided what Anna Kane's life was worth, what her death meant, who she was. She grew up watching people describe her mother as a slain prostitute who deserved what happened to her. Those are not my words. Those are Tamika's words, used by Tamika specifically, because she wanted people to understand what that does to a child, what it does to a family, what it does to a case. Because here is the thing about how victims are described in the media. It does not just affect how the public thinks about a case. It affects how seriously a case is worked. It affects whether tips come in from people who might have information, but decide unconsciously that this is not the kind of case they need to get involved in. It affects whether detectives feel institutional pressure to stay on a case or quietly let it become less of a priority. It affects everything, and Anna Kane deserved none of that. She deserved what every victim deserves, to be investigated with full urgency, to be described with full humanity, to have the people responsible for justice treat her life as something that mattered completely and without qualification. Tamika, who carried this for 34 years before getting her answer, said it herself. She said her mother was caring, outgoing, and honest. She said Anna did not deserve to die the way she did. And then she said the thing that I keep returning to. The thing that is both devastatingly simple and devastatingly necessary. She said she was a person. She was my mother. 3 children, a 9-year-old daughter and 2 boys. That is Anna Kane. That is who we are talking about when we talk about October 23rd, 1988. Not a case number, not a headline, not a word that reduces a human life to a single dimension. A mother of 3 who was 26 years old and had her whole life still ahead of her. Now let me take you to the last night of that life. October 22nd, 1988, a Saturday night in Reading, Pennsylvania. The rain had started before midnight. It was the kind of Pennsylvania autumn rain that settles in and means it, steady and cold, and the sort that soaks through everything. It rained through the night, drumming on the roofs of the row houses, and filling the gutters of the streets, and making the pavement shine under the streetlights. Somewhere in the city that night, Anna Kane was out. We know the broad strokes of her movements from witness accounts and the investigative record that came together in the days after her body was found. We know she was in the area of downtown Reading in the late hours of Saturday night and the very early hours of Sunday morning. At approximately 1 in the morning on Sunday, October 23rd, Anna Kane was seen near the intersection of Franklin Street and South 6th Street in Reading. That is the last confirmed sighting of her alive. What happened in the hours between 1 a.m. and when her body was found, where she went, who she encountered, what unfolded in whatever space she was taken to, that is the gap at the center of this case, a gap that investigators would spend 34 years trying to close. Now, the rain. I need you to hold on to this detail because it will become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. It rained through the night of October 22nd and into the early morning hours of October 23rd. By most accounts, the rain stopped sometime around midnight, which would place it right around or just before the last sighting of Anna. That detail, a rainstorm that stopped around midnight on October 22nd, became crucial to understanding what had happened to her. On the afternoon of October 23, 1988, a body was discovered along Ontolani Trail near Route 662 in Perry Township, Berks County. Ontolani Trail runs through quiet, wooded land, the kind of isolated Pennsylvania countryside that is beautiful and remote in equal measure. In October, it is all bare branches and leaf mulch and cold earth. It is not a place you end up by accident. It is a place someone goes to specifically. A place chosen deliberately because of what it offers. Distance, isolation, the reasonable expectation that whatever you leave there will not be found quickly. When law enforcement arrived and began processing the scene, they noticed something immediately. Something that told them with absolute clarity that they were not looking at a crime that had happened on that trail. The ground beneath the body was wet, soaked through the way ground gets after hours of sustained rainfall. The earth was soft and saturated, the leaf mulch dark with absorbed water, but Anna Kane's clothing was dry. Her clothes, the clothes she had been wearing on the night of October 22nd, the night it rained from before midnight through the early morning hours, were dry. Trooper Daniel Womer, who would later become the lead investigator on this case, described it plainly. We're assuming the incident occurred within 12 hours. The ground was wet beneath her, and yet her clothing was not wet, and it stopped raining around midnight on Saturday. The ground was wet. Her clothes were dry. She was not killed on that trail. She was killed somewhere else, somewhere indoors, somewhere private, somewhere the rain never reached her. And then after the rain had stopped, her body was driven to Ontolani Trail and placed there. Someone had taken her somewhere specific, had done what they did in a private space, and had then driven through the wet Pennsylvania night to leave her in the woods and drive away. The medical examiner confirmed what investigators feared. Anna Jean Kane had been beaten. Around her neck was a length of baling twine, the kind of rough rope used in farming and storage, the kind of utilitarian thing you might find in dozens of places in rural Berks County. It had been tied there with enough force to end her life. Berks County Coroner William R. Fatora confirmed the following day. She had been choked to death. She was 26 years old. Tamika was 9. Pennsylvania State Police opened the investigation immediately. The forensic work done at the scene and during the examination of Anna's body was meticulous. DNA evidence was recovered from her clothing, a male profile, collected with the care and precision that experienced investigators bring to a scene they know they only get one chance at. The evidence was bagged, it was labeled, it was preserved. In 1988, that DNA profile could not be matched to anyone. The FBI's CODIS database, the national system that would eventually become the most powerful cold case tool in American law enforcement, did not yet exist. It would not be established until 1998, a full decade away. What investigators had was the most important piece of evidence in the case, sitting in a property room with no way to attach a name to it. They worked everything they had, witness interviews, canvassing the area where Anna was last seen, trying to reconstruct her movements on the night of October 22nd, looking for anyone who might have seen her after 1 a.m., trying to understand who she had encountered and why it had ended the way it did. Every thread they pulled frayed and broke. The theory that Anna had encountered her killer through prostitution was reasonable and was followed. But reasonable theories without supporting evidence do not make cases. The investigators were doing 1988 detective work on a crime designed to be invisible, committed indoors, with no witnesses, by someone who had thought enough about what he was doing to choose a location and dispose of the body afterward. Weeks passed, months passed. The Pennsylvania State Police continued working the case, continued maintaining the file, continued following the threads that appeared and disappeared. Then in 1990, 16 months after Anna's body was found on that trail in Perry Township, the Reading Eagle ran a front-page story about her unsolved murder. It was good journalism. The kind local papers do when communities deserve answers and aren't getting them. Here is what we know. Here is what we don't know. If anyone has information that might help, please come forward. That story reached a lot of people in Berks County. Most of them read it the way you read news about a tragedy, with sadness, with a vague wish that things were different, and then they turned the page. One person read it differently. One person read that story and recognized it, not from news coverage, from memory, and that person decided to respond. In February 1990, a letter arrived at the Reading Eagle, standard mail, a plain envelope. The kind of letter that comes into a newsroom by the dozens every week. Readers writing about local issues, about things they agree with or take issue with, about the small and large concerns of community life. Nobody in the newsroom would have had any reason to treat this envelope differently from any other, except for what was inside it. The letter was signed with 2 words, concerned citizen. That signature is worth pausing on, because it is not just anonymous, it is performatively anonymous. It is someone choosing the most neutral, most civic-minded, most above-reproach identity they could present to a newspaper. A concerned citizen, someone with no stake in this. Someone who simply cares about the community and wants to help. That is what they wanted the letter to look like. What it actually was something else entirely. Trooper Daniel Womer, describing the letter years later, said it contained numerous intimate details about the homicide of Anna Kane. Intimate details, not things you read in a newspaper story. Not the kind of information that circulates through a community as rumor or gossip. Specific, private, internal details about what had happened to Anna on the night of October 22nd and 23rd, 1988. Details that lived in the investigative file. Details that existed nowhere in the public record. Womer was direct about what investigators concluded. This led investigators to believe that whoever wrote the letter had committed the homicide. Think about what kind of person sits down 16 months after committing a murder and writes to a newspaper about it. Not out of guilt, not to confess, not to turn themselves in, but to insert themselves into the story they created. To reach across the gap between what they know and what anyone else can prove. To feel in some way the control of shaping how the story is being told. People who do this are not rare in criminal history. The Zodiac Killer wrote letters to newspapers. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, sent packages to police and media. Others have communicated in ways that express something between compulsion and arrogance. A need to be part of the story they authored. A need to be seen, even while remaining hidden. This man wrote to the Reading Eagle about Anna Kane's murder 16 months after he committed it. And signed himself a concerned citizen. Then he sealed the envelope. He ran his tongue along the adhesive strip. He pressed the flap down. He addressed it, walked to a mailbox somewhere in Berks County, dropped it in, and went home. That action, that single, automatic, thoughtless action that every person who has ever sent a letter has performed without a second thought, was the most consequential thing he ever did. Because saliva is biological material, and biological material contains DNA. And that DNA, sitting on the adhesive strip of a plain envelope in a Berks County newsroom, was immediately more valuable than the person who left it could possibly have imagined. The letter was turned over to investigators. The envelope was tested. The DNA extracted from the adhesive strip was compared to the male DNA profile recovered from Anna Kane's clothing in 1988. Same contributor. The person who killed Anna Kane was the person who wrote to the Reading Eagle. And they had handed investigators their DNA on a silver platter, sealed inside an envelope addressed to a newspaper, signed with 2 words that were supposed to make them invisible. In 1990, this was simultaneously the most important development in the case and the most frustrating, because having DNA is not the same as having a name. CODIS didn't exist. There was no database to run the profile against. The DNA sat in an evidence file alongside the letter, alongside the envelope, alongside everything else collected in 1988, and the investigation reached another wall. But here is what Sergeant Nathan Trait of Pennsylvania State Police Troop L said about that evidence years later, and I want you to hear it because it matters enormously to what comes next. He said all of that stuff was collected. It was preserved as it should be, because investigators knew probably somewhere down the line what they collected could be that little piece of evidence of what they needed. They knew. The evidence was preserved, the envelope was preserved, the letter was preserved. And 12 years later, the man who wrote it made another mistake that confirmed exactly the same pattern. In 2002, 14 years after he killed Anna Kane, 12 years after he wrote to the Reading Eagle, a man from the Hamburg area of Berks County was arrested on a harassment charge in Exeter Township. The nature of the harassment? Mailing intimidating letters to his former business partner. The same compulsion, the same method. Letters when he felt he had something to communicate that he wasn't willing to say directly. In 1990, he wrote to a newspaper. In 2002, he wrote to someone who had wronged him in business. The same instinct applied twice in different circumstances to the same result. An envelope going somewhere it shouldn't go, signed with his DNA. His name was Scott Grimm. He was from Hamburg, Berks County, Pennsylvania. He had been 26 years old in 1988, exactly Anna's age. He had relocated to the Birdsboro area around the same time she had. They had been neighbors in geography, in timing, in the particular proximity that puts 2 people in the same orbit without anyone registering that it means anything. In 2002, when he was arrested for the harassment charge, his DNA was not collected in a way that entered it into any national database. The charge did not require it. Right? He remained biologically invisible to the systems that were supposed to find people like him. He went home. He continued his life. He grew older. Right? And he believed, as far as we can tell, that the envelope he licked in 1990 was exactly what he thought it was. A clever, anonymous letter from a concerned citizen who could never be found. Right? He was wrong. Right? After 1990, the case did what cold cases do. It got quieter, not closed, not abandoned. The Pennsylvania State Police kept the file open. Right? Successive generations of investigators maintained the evidence, followed new tips when they came in, and waited for something. Some change in technology, some new witness, some development that would allow them to move forward. Nothing came. The 1990s arrived and moved through. CODIS was established in 1998, the national database that would eventually transform cold case investigation in America, and Anna's DNA profile was submitted. It returned no match. Because Scott Grimm, the man who killed her, had never committed a crime that required his DNA to be entered into any database. He lived in the same county where he had murdered her. He drove the same roads. He was completely, totally invisible to every system law enforcement had available. Tamika Reyes was 9 years old in 1988. She turned 15, then 20, then 30. She became an adult who had grown up with a story that had no ending, in a world that had decided, long before she had any say in the matter, what her mother's death meant and how much it was worth. Grieving. She watched coverage of her mother describe Anna as a statistic, as a cautionary tale, as a name attached to a background that seemed to explain everything and excuse the absence of justice. And she kept saying to anyone who would listen that her mother was a person, that she was her mother. That the word the newspapers reached for most easily was not the word that described Anna Jean Kane to the people who loved her. Scott Grimm continued his life in Berks County. He was there the whole time, same county, same roads. The same geography that Anna had occupied, that Tamika was growing up in, that detectives were driving through every day on their way to the Troop L building, where the evidence file sat in a property room. He got older. He became the kind of man who had a past that nobody knew about, which is to say he became, in the eyes of everyone around him, just a man, ordinary, unremarkable. A face in the community with nothing particular attached to it. In 2018, Scott Grimm died. Natural causes. He was 58 years old. He died never having been named, never having been charged. Never having sat in a room with Tamika and been made to understand what his actions on the night of October 22nd, 1988 had cost her and her brothers and everyone who loved Anna Kane. He took whatever he remembered about that night, whatever details he had put into that letter in 1990, whatever he thought about in the small hours when memory surfaces whether you want it to or not. He took all of it with him, or so he thought. Because 4 years after Scott Grimm died, a laboratory looked at the saliva on a 34-year-old envelope and said his name out loud. Genetic genealogy. I want to explain this clearly because the mechanism of how this case broke is as important as the fact that it did. In traditional forensic DNA work, you take a crime scene sample and run it against CODIS, the database of convicted offenders. If the person in CODIS, you get a match. If they are not in CODIS, if they have never committed a crime that required their DNA to be entered, you get nothing. Scott Grimm was not in CODIS. He would never have been found that way. Genetic genealogy works differently. Instead of searching a law enforcement database, you upload the unknown DNA profile to a public genealogy site, one of the databases where millions of ordinary people have voluntarily submitted their own DNA to learn about their family history. You are not looking for the person, you are looking for their relatives. Distant cousins, second cousins, people who share a common ancestor somewhere up the family tree. Then a genetic genealogist, someone with a very specific, very painstaking set of skills, builds a family tree from those partial matches, branch by branch. Cross-referencing birth records and marriage certificates and census data and newspaper announcements and whatever else exists in the public record. Narrowing the tree until it points to a small enough group of real living people that traditional investigation can take over. Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia was engaged on the Anna Kane case. The same company that had cracked the Lindy Sue Beekler case in Lancaster County, the case I covered in our last episode. They work on cold cases across the country. They have a track record that reads like a list of the impossible becoming possible. They took the DNA from Anna's case, the profile from her clothing collected in 1988, confirmed against the DNA from the envelope in 1990, and they went to work. What came back was a name. Scott Grimm, Hamburg, Berks County, Pennsylvania. Trooper Daniel Womer described the moment at the August 2022 press conference. Recently, we did genetic genealogy, which was completed by Parabon Nanolabs based out of Virginia. They were able to determine that a possible suspect was Scott Grimm. Pennsylvania State Police then did what investigators always do when genetic genealogy produces a name. They sought to confirm it through direct DNA comparison. They obtained a direct DNA sample from Scott Grimm. That sample was sent to the Pennsylvania State Police Laboratory. Womer described the results. We had our Pennsylvania State Police Lab do a direct comparison to the DNA from the letter in 1990, as well as the original evidence from the victim's clothing, all of which showed the same contributor being Scott Grimm. His DNA profile was on all of those items. All of those items. The DNA from Anna's clothing in 1988, the DNA from the envelope in 1990, and the same contributor, Scott Grimm. The man who had licked that envelope in a moment of arrogance and anonymity, believing that the technology of 1990 was the only technology that would ever exist, had underestimated something fundamental, that evidence preserved correctly keeps getting more powerful as science advances, that what cannot be read in 1990 can be read in 2022, that the gap he thought was permanent had a closing date. On August 18, 2022, Pennsylvania State Police and Berks County District Attorney John Adams held a press conference in Reading, Pennsylvania. They announced that the 34-year-old cold case murder of Anna Kane had been solved. The responsible party was Scott Grimm. Scott Grimm, who had died 4 years earlier at age 58 in the same county where he had murdered her. Tamika Reyes got the call. She said, "I felt a little bit of everything when I found out. I was happy to finally put a face behind the monster who took her from us and upset that he will never be able to face consequences. A little bit of everything, happy and upset simultaneously." That is what 34 years of waiting and then finally knowing feels like from the inside, not one clean emotion, not relief or peace or resolution. Something more complicated and more honest than any of those words. She had a face now, she had a name. She knew who took her mother on the night of October 22nd, 1988, and drove her body to a trail in Perry Township and left her there, and then, with an arrogance that I still cannot fully comprehend, wrote to the local newspaper about it. The case of Anna Kane is what law enforcement calls cleared by exception. It means identified but unable to prosecute. The responsible party has been formally named. The evidence has been examined. The DNA has confirmed, with the kind of scientific certainty that leaves no room for reasonable doubt, who killed Anna on the night of October 22nd and 23rd, 1988. But Scott Grimm is dead. There will be no arrest. There will be no trial. There will be no moment in a courtroom where charges are read and a verdict is delivered and a sentence is handed down. That reality is genuinely hard to sit with. D. John Adams stood at those microphones in August 2022 and said it as plainly as it could be said. "I know in some respects the fact that he is deceased, he will never face justice as we all would. I have hoped for this homicide. But we solved it. We gave some closure to the family. We solved it. We gave some closure. That is what is available." That is what 34 years of preserved evidence and 1 letter's worth of preserved saliva and 1 year's worth of genetic genealogy work produced. Not a conviction, but a name. Not a sentence, but an answer. Captain Robert Bailey, commanding officer for Troop L, said something else at that press conference. Something that deserves to be heard clearly. He said every victim, despite their background, deserves closure. Every victim, despite their background. He was talking about Anna. He was acknowledging directly, on record, at a press conference, with cameras rolling, that the way Anna Kane had been described and treated in the years after her death had not dimmed the obligation to find who killed her, that her background, her struggles, her history did not make her less deserving of investigation, did not make her family less deserving of an answer. That sentence should not need to be said, but Captain Bailey said it, and I am glad he did. There is a detail in this case I keep coming back to. Not the DNA, not the press conference, not even the letter, as extraordinary as that is. It is the moment in 1990 when the Reading Eagle ran their front page story about Anna's unsolved murder, asking the community for information. And the man who killed her read it, sat down, picked up a pen, and decided to write back. Signed himself a concerned citizen, licked the envelope, mailed it, and then went home believing that was the cleverest thing he had ever done. What he did not know, what he could not possibly have known in February 1990, is that the human body does not keep secrets. That the biological material he deposited on that envelope adhesive was not anonymous. that it had his name in it, encoded in every molecule, waiting for the science that would eventually learn to read it. He thought the gap between what he knew and what anyone could prove was permanent. He was wrong by 34 years. Anna Kane was 26 years old when she was murdered on a rainy October night in 1988. She was beaten and strangled and left in the woods of Perry Township like she was something to be discarded rather than a person to be mourned. She was not discarded. She was a mother, and Tamika's mother, her 2 boys' mother. She was caring and outgoing and honest. By the testimony of the daughter who loved her and who waited 34 years in a world that had decided what her mother was worth before it knew anything real about her. Scott Grimm escaped the courtroom. He died in 2018 without hearing his name spoken in connection with what he did. Without sitting across from Tamika and being made to understand what his actions cost her. Without any of the formal public accountability that justice is supposed to deliver. But he did not escape being named. He did not escape being known. He did not escape the consequence of the envelope he sealed in February 1990. The envelope that sits even now in an evidence file in Berks County, with his DNA on the adhesive strip, with his arrogance sealed inside it. History knows what he did. And Anna Kane, whose name was reduced to a single word for 34 years, whose daughter had to stand in front of cameras and say the most basic possible thing about another human being. Anna Kane has her answer. She has her verdict. If this story stayed with you, share it. Not for this channel, for Anna, for Tamika, who carried this for 34 years, for the 2 boys who grew up without their mother. Leave a candle in the comments for Anna Kane. Subscribe to Buried Verdict. Every week we go somewhere most people are too afraid to look. I will see you in the next one.